to exploit this situation, and they don't want people having a significant amount of control over their own capital. So that's why they're pushing these kind of draconian measures.
Absolutely. It's all about control. It's about central bank control. Now, they like to spin it as saying that it is something that is benign and beneficial. But, of course, it isn't going to be benign and beneficial if they take away your freedom and your independence. And related to that, I mean, is what they're doing with the automotive cars, the self-driving autonomous cars, saying that they're going to take away, and of course we've had Elon Musk say it won't be that long before humans will be banned from driving cars. We've got the head of Uber saying that once they get self-driving taxis, then individual car ownership will just go away. All of these are control points. Your movement, your physical movement, and of course your movement of cash, your control of cash. And they want to know, Paul, everything about you, which is what we've just been talking about, mastering the human domain, looking at all of our metadata, looking at our social network, looking at what we do, where we go, the cash that we have. It's all part of that dominating the human domain. And that's a very troubling idea, but that certainly, I think, describes very well the broad policies of our government, not just abroad, but certainly directed here in the United States.
Exactly, and they want you to know that they're collecting all your data, not really because most of the data is very useful, simply for the fact that if you know you're being watched, you self-police, you change your behavior, you dissuade yourself from engaging in free speech, from criticizing authority. So just the very notion that you're under surveillance, never mind what information they've got on you, is a control mechanism. And then going back to this quote, this column by Levis in the Telegraph, he said, quote, "If notes and coins were abolished and the only way to hold money was through a government-controlled bank, there would be no escape." So he's that brazen in talking about how people their finances will be locked down in prison within this central banker-controlled system. You know, it's akin to having a bank account where you have to get government permission to take out your money.
Yes,
We're talking about a tax on financial transactions too.
Paul, can you stay with us one more segment?
Sure.
Okay, we're going to be right back with Paul Joseph Watson. Stay with us. Paul, as we look at Bilderberg coming up, it's important to remember that the EU and the Euro were put out there at the very first Bilderberg meeting. What was that, in 1955, I think?
Yeah, that's right. And the EU is going to be a big subject coming up because, of course, now that the Tories have won again in Britain, we're going to have an EU referendum on whether Britain stays in the European Union before 2017. Last year, we saw a massive revolt in the Euro elections against that Bilderberg model of European federalism. But the security precautions for this year's Bilderberg, from what I've read so far, seem to be way more intense than what we saw last year in Copenhagen, which was relatively relaxed. They've got the Cobra anti-terror forces on standby, ready to provide security at Bilderberg 2015. This was an organization formed in response to the attack on Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Olympics, and their speciality is hostage rescue and basically dealing with terrorists. They're armed with assault rifles, pistols, and grenade launchers. They're going to be on hand for what is probably going to amount to about 100 to 200 protesters who actually show up to demonstrate against Bilderberg, because it's in a quite remote area in the Austrian Alps.
So you kind of got Cobra protecting Hydra there, right?
Yeah. So
I'm sorry, go ahead.
The mistake they've made is they're using the same intensity of security procedures for G7, which is a few days before in Bavaria, Germany, and then basically using that same model for Bilderberg, when we know it's a completely different crowd. In fact, the left-wing protesters, some of which are, you know, agitators and black bloc anarchists who protest G7, aren't interested in Bilderberg. They never have been. You never see those kind of protesters at Bilderberg. But now they're saying in Austrian media today that the police are expecting violent protesters to show up at Bilderberg. There's never been one instance of violence at Bilderberg protests in the past. They're talking about 2,100 police officers on standby for Bilderberg. I mean, if they show up in those numbers, they will outnumber the protesters about 10 to 1. at least.
And why would they need this massive police state? You know, this is just a little friendly meeting with a few corporations and politicians, you know, meeting behind closed doors. When we looked at what happened last year, they were, as you pointed out, it was very lax compared to all the other Bilderbergs. I mean, we were just across the, we were as close as being across a four-lane road with a median in between it.
Yeah, and that's the closest anybody's probably ever got, where they weren't harassed by police, where they weren't moved on. So that was quite unprecedented. Obviously, Bilderberg security were uncomfortable with that, and I think it's going to be a lot different this time, because they're talking about Black Hawk military helicopters. They're talking about roadblocks on all the major roads surrounding the hotel. They're even talking about police presence on these alpine hike and bike trails just for locals and tourists who are going to be on hikes.
They sound like a bunch of
way more intense than usual.
They sound like paranoid conspiracy theorists. You know, though, when we look at this, and we see that they're meeting in secret, as they have for decades. For many decades, everybody would laugh at you if you even talked about Bilderberg. Of course, that doesn't even exist. They were able to keep that essentially a secret. And I think, Paul, when we look at how this went on for many decades, now, of course, we've got a massive treaties that will unite North America with Europe, unite North America with the Pacific, the transatlantic, the trans-Pacific partnership agreements. These things are all coming together, coming to fruition, being negotiated for years in secret by corporate lobbyists. When we ignore the things like Bilderberg, like the Council on Foreign Relations, effect on issues on government, this is what we wind up with. We wind up with things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think it's people need to understand that they're now talking about, in Europe, taking away the sovereignty of the different nations. We've had Alan Greenspan, as well as the head of PIMCO, one of the world's largest bond companies, talking about how they're not going to solve this Greek tragedy without the European nations surrendering their sovereignty to the EU, which was essentially put together as a trade bloc.
Yeah, and that's likely what they're going to be talking about at Bilderberg. I know that they're going to be talking about Agenda 21 and sustainable development, which again is based around this Plandopolis, lowering our standard of living. And that all ties into this restriction on sovereignty, which of course is Bilderberg's raison d'etre. So that's definitely going to be near the top of the agenda.
Yeah, well, as they consolidate wealth, and they're going to be looking at ways that they can take possession of the land. Of course, that's what Agenda 21 is about. When you look at John McCain in Arizona selling off this massive amount of public lands, parklands, historical value, religious significance to the Indians there that was under a treaty since the early 1950s. Of course, selling that off to a foreign corporation that's going to create a crater that you'll be able to see from space. This is what it looks like. This is what you see when the senators like McCain or Harry Reid take an area and they sell it off to a foreign corporation. We can see elements of it in the Keystone Pipeline, where you've got TransCanada, a Canadian corporation, given the rights of condemnation, of eminent domain, taking people's farms that they've had in their family for over 100 years, allowing a foreign corporation to do that for their own private use. That's what we're going to see more and more of. That's what they're probably talking about in terms of Agenda 21 at this Bilderberg meeting. How are they going to now take possession of what they own after they've gotten us into so much debt?
Yeah, and of course, with TPP, I mean, Paul Ryan's trying to make the argument today that we need the United States to be in control of these agreements rather than China. It's not about that. It's about the fact that foreign corporations are going to have the power to change US laws. That's not a pro-business position. That's not a fiscally conservative position. That's a direct threat to sovereignty, no matter where you stand in terms of the political spectrum. So that's why people are concerned about TPP, and that's why they want to know the details.
They've been able to laugh for decades about the idea that Bilderberg was meeting in secret. And now what we see is a trade negotiation that is being done in secret. And as Senator Sessions has pointed out, Paul, once this is given fast-track authority, of course, they've already negotiated the agreements that they want, so it'll be a couple of weeks that people have finally a chance to look at the agreement publicly. But there will be no amendments made to it. But as Senator Sessions pointed out, they will be able to amend this without any further input from our elected representatives. Thank you so much for joining us. Paul Joseph Watson, stay with us. We'll be right back. Bad trends. Of course, we see the police state ramping up in the UK with recent counter-terrorism pronouncements by David Cameron saying that, prior to this point, if you just obeyed the law, we would be very tolerant of you. But those days are over. Signaling a kind of a pre-crime scrutiny of people that we've not seen before in Western societies. It's just ramping up incrementally. Nevertheless, there is still some good news. Here's a bit of good news. Huge victory. USDA introduces official non-GMO label. This is a story from Natural Society. They point out in response to the sounds of public outcry, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is being forced to do something. They have now come up with a new certification companies can use to show that their products are free of GMOs. Now, as this article points out, you have to kind of be careful about how the labels are set up, and I guess it still remains to be seen exactly what they're going to have in this. The non-GMO projects verified label that says that the whatever you're buying is not GMO does not certify that there are no pesticides. In other words, they could put some very dangerous inorganic pesticides on the produce and it could still be non-GMO as long as the pesticides and the plant were not genetically modified. That's why organic is so important. And of course, there's another article that I think is very helpful. If you look at this on Infowars.com, this is an article from Dr. Group, Where to Find Natural Building Materials. Use all organic products in your next project. Because that reminds us that it's not just the food that we eat, but it's also many other things that we come in contact with that can give us exposure to inorganic chemicals, to things that can be very toxic. This is a great article. I'm not going to go over it in detail, but again, you'll find that at Infowars.com, Where to Find Natural Building Materials. And then finally, there's this article that comes out of Sweden. And what they had was Sweden's co-op and Swedish Environmental Research Institute decided that they would do an experiment with a family to see how long it would take for them to get pesticide levels out of their body if they started eating organic. So what they did was they took a family of four, 2 adults, 3 kids that were aged 12, 10, and 3. They started giving them organic food. They measured their urine samples every morning to see how many pesticides. Had 12 known pesticides and metabolites that they were looking at, and they wanted to see how long it would take to purge this out of their system. The good news is that it happened in only 2 weeks. Just 2 weeks of eating organic, they could get the pesticides or being sprayed on their food that had been stored in their body, they could get it out in that amount of time. It's very important to understand that, as I mentioned, you can get organics in the food that you eat. You can get it in the materials that you build with, what you're exposed to. It's also important to understand that there are also internal changes that are going on in your body. That's why when I was talking about our new product, Prostagard, I mentioned the fact that as you get older, you get a form of testosterone called dihydrotestosterone. One way that you can deal with that is with things like saw palmetto or lycopene. You can find that in our new product, Prostagard. That's available at an introductory price of $5 off. We also have a 20% sale on Super Male and Super Female Vitality. That'll save you $12 per bottle. And that's a very important thing, too, because it's a source of non-GMO natural nutrients that you can get that will also help to deal with the changes in your body as you're getting older. As men age, they often experience a slowdown in vitality and energy, overall wellness, and Super Male Vitality is specifically designed to assist the body in regulating proper balance to create superior vitality in males. So again, that's something that you can do to try to take care of your own health, even if you can't get the government to stop putting pesticides in the water. That's what fluoride is. It's essentially a pesticide. They sell it that way in China. You can still filter it out. You can get nutrients that will help your body to deal with that, to help you to purge that out. Well, that's our good news. Now, I have to tell you some other bad news. There's a couple of very disturbing police videos that came out in just the last couple of days. One of these came out, I think it was yesterday that this came out, where a sheriff in Kentucky tells reporters about a shooting. He says, well, I'm just glad the unarmed guy we shot was white. Pretty amazing pronouncement. But of course, the local police chief that he had the press conference